My court date was approaching against InfoWars, so it was clear that I was going to be filmed, and I was going to be filmed in court and outside of court. And so protecting my privacy had reached a conclusion. I could no longer hide that way. But at the same time, a significant amount of time had passed. My children were not small anymore. I don't have to feel like I am putting them in danger. A lot of things have changed. So after that, I have interviewed just one time before on camera. Before this is the second time, without shadowing or hiding my face. December 14th was an ordinary day. It was a Friday in Connecticut. It was a cold day. I drove my children to school that morning. We had fun in the morning. We listened to the music on the drive. We had about a 20-minute drive. And it was really an ordinary day until half hour later. There were messages on my phone and voicemails and text messages from friends. And that, when I was at the gym and when I got back to the locker room, I looked at my phone. And then from then on, there was just fear and adrenaline. And I was just heading to the school. That was all I knew. And when I got to the school, it was complete chaos. There was no place to park. There was just people everywhere. And the focus was figuring out where my kids are. And the kids were lining up in the parking lot of the firehouse, which was next door to the school. And so that's where I eventually, my two daughters found me. But there was no news about Noah. So we were instructed that if we haven't been reunited with our child, to go to the back of the firehouse. And there they kept us waiting for a long time. They didn't give us any information. They just kept us in there. And it was quite surreal. I mean, there were people weeping and crying, and obviously they were listening to the radio on the drive over, so they knew a lot more than I did at that point. But I was probably in denial for the rest of the day. I at some point took my daughters to a friend's house, and then I went there myself, and I was still in denial for the rest of that day. But at some point in the middle of the night, a social worker came to Noah's mother, Veronique's house, and I was there at the time talking to her. We were already separated, but it was like 1 o'clock at night. Social worker came with a clipboard, list of names, and, repeated the name, Noah, and said, your son is deceased. And that was it. And then moved on to the next family. The names of the victims were going to be announced in the morning, so they needed to get that done. So that's how my first day started, from being an ordinary day to being the worst day to, being the worst week, month of my life. And I was kind of on a media blackout, not looking at the news. But when I started looking at the news, I started to see how my tragedy was being reported on. And that in itself was very surreal, because it's such a global event. You have no control over how it's being reported on, even the mainstream media. So the mainstream media was making mistakes in how they were reporting it. And that was my first interaction with getting Noah's story accurate. So a few weeks after the tragedy, a newspaper printed that Noah was shot 11 times. I asked them to make the change, to retract it. They wouldn't do it. They did not take my word that I had more information than them, and they wouldn't do it. I had to go and get an autopsy report from Noah and present it to the newspaper for them to even consider changing it. And they were more annoyed that I was bothering them, and never got an apology or anything. But it took a lot of effort, took a lot of energy to do that. So I started off with making those corrections in how it was reported, because I knew that these things will survive on the internet forever and will give more ammunition to people who are looking for discrepancies in news reporting. And of course, searching for Noah, I saw right away that InfoWars was reporting on it. Their blogs and forums were spreading lies about crisis actors and family members and targeting different people by name. And then they had some weird theory because they didn't know what I looked like, that I didn't go to Noah's funeral because there were no photos of me. So that's when I realized that this is for them some kind of reality show, and they're basing it on what they see, not on what reality is. And I had a number of other things that were going on in my life, so I couldn't deal with it at that point. But by 2014, I was able to start addressing it, and I made myself available to some of these deniers. I joined a closed Facebook group and said, here I am, what would you like to know? I can share my experience of that day, and that's all I know. And just me being there seemed to agitate them because they were having their own little fun party, and me showing up was, upsetting them. So they were triggered by the tragedy, they were triggered by me being there, and they started attacking me. That was it. That was clear that they were just somehow injured by the idea of women and children being slaughtered, and they were taking it out on whoever is standing. And that was the pattern. And from there, the theories escalated and built and continued to target the victims, the families of the victims. And that got people energized and agitated and angry at the victims themselves, who were people that may have just not known and spoken to the press very early on as best as they could, in the condition that they were in. And that resulted in, interviews where people may have not acted as the deniers considered to be authentic. They found things that they thought that were unusual. This is not how a person is supposed to act in these circumstances. This is not how a person is supposed to look. This is not how they're supposed to behave. And they started to, I've always considered that a lot of the people who responded with this way of denial were themselves injured by the concept of the tragedy, and they had their own version of trauma that they were working through, and their way of working through it was to victim shame and attack the victim and blame the victim, who they see as being the cause of what they were feeling. And the only way to stop feeling it is to deny this, tremendous injury that happened to the families, the community, the country. That was what started going viral in a time where social media was not focused on content moderation. It was focused on expansion and growth. What I remember is that that's when they first started talking about crisis actors. That was before people were really familiar with that reference. And for them, it meant that this is just a drill, and the kind of actors that are used when emergency services practices and rehearses in the event of crisis, what's going to happen. So certain people are the actors that are there to play the part of the wounded. So in their minds, as I said, that they think this is like a show or a movie because it's on TV, and And so everyone there is acting and it's all scripted. Um, the deniers were all over the world about this. It wasn't just the US. They were in Canada and as far as Australia and everything else in between. It wasn't unique to just this country. The internet brought it everywhere at the same time. Um, and what I learned then was that when there's a tragedy at that of that magnitude, um, oftentimes you become a spectator to your own tragedy, and you just have to observe how it's being reported on. They they got very invasive background checks on me, and they distributed it amongst thousands and thousands of people about reports that have everything in it from every address I've ever lived in, every phone number I've ever had, financial information, social security number information. Um, just you makes you feel like you're now being hunted by people who are not stable, and that makes me very concerned. I mean, of course, I've already lost one child, and now they're putting the rest of my family in danger yet again, and they think that they are some force of good. So it's a really upside down world that it turns into. Noah's mother, my current ex-wife, she did some interviews, and they accused her of being um, too well spoken, being too calm. She couldn't possibly be a parent of a child that was murdered in the way that she's carrying on. She's not crying enough, or her makeup is too perfect, or whatever it is they can, or she's too old to have a 6-year-old child, anything that they can come up with. And then it gets repeated. And then they have this large repertoire of information that they just keep regurgitating, where most of it has been disproven and debunked, but they still repeat it, and they just ignore the debunking about those things that other volunteers may be debunking. And they see this entire topic as a grand conspiracy theory, which is that everybody is involved in it, every layer of government, every part of the community, anyone that provides real information becomes part of this conspiracy theory. So it grows into this, it just keeps expanding no matter what is there, because people who are committed to this denial are so identified as in their own mind. They're so committed to this that they've restructured all of their beliefs to fit in line with that all of their values are now consistent with that it is okay to attack victims because they're lying, and no matter what, they won't change their mind. So it is a very dark force that causes people to act out. And eventually the wrong person does come across this information and does act out. And there have been, a number of instances where people have thought that they were a force of good, and they've picked up a weapon and they've traveled somewhere and maybe even discharged the weapon because they were a force of good and everybody else is a bad guy. But at some point, they may realize that their information was wrong. They've been lied to, but it's already too late. So prior to the tragedy, I was familiar with some of the conspiracy theories that are popular, and that was a way of just, for me, it was maybe a form of entertainment, like science fiction, where you deny, some things may be denied, but you suspend your disbelief for a short period of time, and you just say, what if, and you watch it. And this was a transformation now where I no longer had the luxury to just be an observer. Now this was focusing in on something very real in my own life that was, the extreme. That's, one of the worst things that anyone can imagine having to live with. And then being attacked. So really I went through a series of learning phases after that early on when most people couldn't even um, touch on this topic. Then everyone just ignored it because that was, just the only thing that they can think that they had the energy to do. But I understood that this was becoming viral, that it was very dangerous. It was really vilifying private people. And with the comments, some of the comments were talking about violence and just, it was this reaction. People were clearly in pain about the idea of that type of tragedy, which, was the most unthinkable. It's women and children being murdered, slaughtered, basically. And so they reacted a certain way. I thought I would talk to people who felt the need to deny it and make myself accessible and share my own experience, because I couldn't give them the answers that they wanted, but I could tell them about what happened to me that day and the day after and the day after that. That's all I had. And I shared some of Noah's documentation about his life, about his death, about how he lived. I was posting photos of him, excuse me. And I soon realized that a lot of the people were not interested in truth. They were just on their own. They were on their own journey, and they needed to deny it, and they were getting something out of it: camaraderie, friendship, attention, money, celebrity status, and that's what they were interested in. And so the more real the information that I was presenting, the more of a threat that I was to their own, you know, their own objectives. So I realized that, the people that I had convinced and the people that I did communicate with went back to their normal life. And the people that remained were just trolls that were, in many ways, sadistic, and there was nothing useful that I could accomplish. And I switched directions to removing the content that was spreading in a viral way, and thinking of it in terms of, I think back then I was referring to it as a thought virus that just wants to replicate as its own thing. And I realized that my focus needs to be content removal, to not necessarily to inoculate people from it, but just contain the virus is what my objective was. And that's what I started doing. And in doing that, it put me in a certain position where people found what I was doing to be offensive and vulgar, because I was taking away their art, their creation, their speech. And, that's their position. And I was on my trajectory. And there was a collision there between them and I. But I didn't really have the option to do anything else other than what I was doing, which is to protect the memory of my son. So they take issue with me removing their content, and perhaps they're justified, but that isn't for me to decide, because I am, as I said, on my own journey with that, which is to limit the harassment and abuse and the victimization and vilification of my family and the memory of my son, and that was it. I know there was one group of people, they were interviewing me for something they were working on, and they were young, they were students, but and I showed them some videos of the children who are no longer alive, of doing things and moving around, and they got very weepy. They got tears in their eyes, and it sort of transferred to me, and so we were all very, kind of partially crying. And then they said, well, we should get that on camera. I said, but not everything belongs on camera. But their excuse is they're just students. So, but I think that some of that type of thinking still makes its way onto news reporting, and I think in some instances it doesn't need to be shown. I don't think it helps. You can't bring somebody a video of an opera while you're sitting watching an opera, but you're giving them a video without sound. They're not having the same experience. So an image without the commitment to the loss and the pain is just a picture. There's a whole multiple dimensions that are missing in that. So in some ways it's turning into something abstract, but which is fine, but it's not the whole. It's not communicating the experience. If you wanted to convey that message, you have to transfer the pain somehow to the observer. And, there's really no way to do that right now. Well, if you communicated it 100% and you were able to communicate trauma 100% to the observer, then you would be injuring your observer. So your audience would be changed permanently. Somebody could have a heart attack.